Somewhere there's music, how faint the tune. Somewhere there's heaven, how high the moon. How high the moon. Hi, my name is Jackie Anderson, and I chose to read this book to you because I love the song, as you could probably tell. It's a jazz standard. It was made famous by Ella Fitzgerald. And I also know a little bit about the author. So the author is Karen Parsons. And if you ever watched The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Karen Parsons was Hillary. So keep that in mind. So in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Hillary was really rich, but her real life wasn't like that at all. She was pretty poor. She grew up with a single mom. She had a black mother and a white father, and the father wasn't around a while. So she kind of struggled, but she found herself when writing books. So when I get a book, the first thing I do is turn it over to the back and read about it. So I'm going to read this to you so you'll know what we're going to be talking about. In the Jim Crow South, 12-year-old Ella spends her days fishing and running around the small town of Alcaloo, South Carolina, with her cousins Henry and Myrna. But life is not always so sunny for Ella, who gets bullied for her lighter skin tone and whose mother is away pursuing a jazz career up in Boston. So Ella is ecstatic when her mother invites her to visit her for Christmas. She doesn't expect to uncover new truths about her mother, the father she never knew, and the family's most unlikely history. After a life-changing trip, she returns south and is shocked by the news that her schoolmate George has been arrested for the murder of two local white girls. Now you have to remember, this story took place in like the 40s and early 50s. Bittersweet and eye-opening, How High the Moon is a stunning and timeless debut novel about a girl finding herself in a world all but determined to hold her down. Okay, so then I open it up, and here's Karen Parsons. Let's see what it says. Karen Parsons is best known for her role as Will Smith's cousin Hillary Banks on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Since then, Karen has gone on to found and produce Sweet Blackberry, which is an award-winning series of children's animated films to share stories about unsung Black heroes and histories. That's interesting. Then, one more thing. If you go a little further, there's some acknowledgments. So in her acknowledgments, of course, acknowledges her mom and her friends and all, so you can read through that. And then she adds one more thing that I think is really interesting, and it is a discussion guide. Okay? So the discussion guide asks you some questions about the book. So I kind of read those first so I can know what I should look for. I'm going to read a couple of them to you. The novel takes place in the Jim Crow South. What did you know about Jim Crow or Jim Crow laws before reading How High the Moon? How did that inform your reading? And what have you learned throughout the book? So that's one question. At the end of the book, Ella is the little girl who Hillary named Ella after Ella Fitzgerald. So she's the heroine in this story. Ella discovers that her father was a white man. Why do you think Ella's father being white was a secret? How were interracial relationships viewed during that time? And here's one more. George's story, so that's George Stinney. George's story is based on a real-life story of George Stinney Jr. Prior to reading the book, were you aware of his story? Why do you think it was so easy to wrongfully imprison him and sentence him to death with no evidence? So there's a lot to this story. One more thing before we get started. The story was written with Ella and her two cousins, Henry and Myrna. So in some of these chapters, you'll see Ella wrote it. Some of the chapters Henry wrote, and some of the chapters Myrna wrote. So make sure you're aware of whose chapter you're reading, okay? And I think with that, we'll get started. How High the Moon. She dedicated this book to her mom. It says, for my mom. So this is Ella talking. What was I thinking leaving home with no shoes? Running down our driveway and onto the packed and dry dirt road, I hardly noticed my bare feet. I had heard Granny calling after me, but the words didn't make sense until I'd already turned off and ran into the woods and towards the creek, where the fallen blackberry brambles and knotty tree limbs had stabbed and scraped me. Ella, your shoes, she hollered after me. I tore through the woods, my legs trying to keep pace with my pounding heart. Later at home, I discovered deep patches and cuts covering my ankles and the soles of my feet. One cut was so deep, I'd have a trail of blood across the porch and clear onto the kitchen. But I couldn't feel none of that now. There was such good news. I was finally going to live in Boston with my mama. Boston was nothing like South Carolina. Up there, colored folks, that's what they called us back then, colored folks could go anywhere they wanted. And you didn't have to wait for church to dress in fancy clothes. Fancy was just life. There were all kinds of people from all over the world. Italian, Chinese, French. And they brought their own food with them too. You could eat Chinese food in Boston. Everything was big and everything was so clean and nice. People were so sophisticated. My mama had been living up there for quite a while. She'd been living there so long that when she came to visit us in Alcala, you could see the difference in her a mile away. She'd be walking up the road and people would take note, for they even made out the features of her face. I mean, sure, she had always stood out from the rest. She'd always been different from the other folks in our little town, but now they gave it a name. She was a city girl. Can you believe it? I spun around, did a fan kick, and whoop, an envelope fell out of my side pocket of my overalls. Oh, shoot, Henry. I handed him the letter. I almost forgot this was for you. Now, Henry is her cousin. Henry's face beamed when he looked at the letter and recognized the handwriting. His daddy had been fighting in the war for almost 2 years, and Henry missed him as something awful. He saved every letter his father sent, and sometimes he'd even sit down on the bed and read them all, from the first one to the last, like it was a little book. Thanks, he said. I'll read it later. He tucked it in his front pocket and did his best to hide the smile. Getting a letter from his daddy made him happier than anything else, but Henry didn't want to make me feel bad that I didn't have a daddy to write me letters. I pointed to the place where I had stashed the envelope. Maybe Mom was ready to tell me about my daddy, I said. Running through the trees, I turned to see something startling. A tiny stockinged foot dangled directly over me, motionless bodies like Christmas tree ornaments, but without any sparkle or cheer. They were close to each other, but not touching. The daddy's dark straw hat had fallen off and was lying at the base of the tree a few feet away. The baby girl's brown buckled shoe was just below her. It was hard to see. Other than that, there were a few other items there. Sweaters were buttoned, belts were clinched. It must have just happened a few hours before we arrived, perhaps in the morning, just before school. Except for the grim expressions, they look the way that it must have been in life. They looked like a regular colored family, but they were hanging from a tree. I ran and told Granny what I had seen. I described the family and all the horribleness of it. She squeezed her eyes shut and squeezed them tight and shook her head hard. I heard her say a quick and quiet prayer under her breath as she disappeared in the kitchen. She returned with a glass of water for each of us. Been a long time since I heard of anyone in Clarendon County getting themselves lynched, she said, shaking her head again. I reckon those folks were from somewhere else and they were just running. The dad probably got into trouble with some white folks and they had to run. I like taking the train. I am on my way now to see my mama. A train is like one big Greyhound bus, but even bigger. Granny told me to be sure to use the bathroom before I left, but I was so excited I'd forgotten. Boston! Next stop, Boston! My stomach was tight with nerves, and I could hardly sit back in my seat. When I arrived at the station, I searched the sea of bodies for Mama. There were so many people on the platform, far more people than in Charleston Station, and there was so much movement and commotion. Mama! I grabbed my suitcase and dashed for the exit. I saw Mama. Baby, my mama called. A delicious cloud of sweet vanilla enveloped my entire body as Mama wrapped her arms around me and squeezed me tight. I didn't want to let go. When we finally did break and were walking out of the station, I held her hand tight. So proud to be walking with her. So proud that she was my mama. So I think I'll stop there. I hope you enjoyed the reading. I want you to read about the Stinney events in her life. So I want you to pick up this book and read it from cover to cover. Okay? So read about that. Read about George Stinney. Look at the discussion questions. And I hope you like it. I know I did. How High the Moon, Karen Parsons. Bye-bye.